If you don't mind, then let's begin our event today. I would like to welcome you all to our event today, and I also would like to welcome and greet our guests from Europe, from Brussels, Commissioner Janez Lenarc, and I'm honored to be like a moderator for the event where he is participating, given our long-standing friendship since I think 2002. The event is taking place as part of the Center for the Study of Europe, Europe in the World series, sponsored by Jean Monnet Chair. As you know well, the title of our event is Responding to a Perfect Storm of Crisis in Ukraine and Beyond, a European Perspective. I also see that I don't know whether I can attribute this to the storm, that nobody is sitting in the first row. Feel free to come close, because I don't think that European Union will help address storms appearing in the world. Let me make a couple of comments about points about Janez Lenarc. You probably know, those who have time to read through his biography, CV made available to you. About his achievements, I will today just highlight a couple of them from my perspective, and let me be less formal. First, I have to be formal when speaking about his current position, because it's so formal. It's a commissioner position. So he took his this position, the role of European Commissioner for Crisis Management, in 2019. And as such, he's responsible for EU civil protection as well as humanitarian aid, with an overall focus on ensuring that the European Commission has the tools and the capacity to respond swiftly and efficiently whenever the EU is called upon, whether in Europe or elsewhere in the world. I think I will learn more about that from your lecture, Commissioner Lenarc. But I would like here to point out something else. Unlike most of European commissioners, Ambassador Lenarc or Commissioner Lenarc is a career diplomat. It doesn't happen often, particularly in Brussels at this level, that a career diplomat comes to that point to become commissioner. Most of them are political appointees. So then this is a message for students that being a diplomat, pursuing career in that field, only sky's the limit if you know how to do it. And you can end up being, say, secretary in this country, or doing some more important or equally important jobs, not, compromising your values and principles. So I would like also to highlight another thing. He was Commissioner Lenarc was director of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights in Warsaw. Many Americans don't know, not heard about that. It's a watchdog, human rights watchdog in Europe, but not only in Europe, in the whole OSCE area, including this country. That watchdog is in charge of sending observers to observe elections, including midterm elections and presidential elections in the US. And those observers also make recommendations that countries are supposed to take into account and adjust their electoral system according to the standards which are to be applied. I have to tell you that observers have made many recommendations to this country to change its to accommodate its electoral system to the standards that exist in other countries. But as you can imagine, this country didn't accept those recommendations and stick to its own electoral system. That speaks about the importance of order, but also limitations that order has in its work. But Janez Lenarc, as a director, was recognized on both sides, on this side of Atlantic and on Moscow side, as being a neutral, proactive actor in promoting democratic values that Europe stands for. Finally, I will make one more point about languages he speaks, if you allow me, Mr. Lenarc. I see that you are humble because you mentioned only 3 of them, English, French, and Serbian. But speaking Serbian, you actually speak several more languages since new languages appeared on European map. It's not just about languages like Croatian, Bosnian, or Montenegrin. It's about identities that European Union and Europe should deal with and should keep in mind, and to keep them in harmony on everyday work. And this is a role of European Commission and commissioners like Janez Lenarc. I will stop here, Mr. Lenarc, or if I may, Janez, please, the floor is yours, and looking forward to your presentation.
Dear Professor Garcevic, dear Vesko, thank you very much for your introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here at the party school, and I really am grateful for the invitation to Professor Schilde and the faculty. You mentioned my work with the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, referred to often by its acronym ODIHR, which not so good-willing people twist it into oh dear. And it was quite an adventure, I can say. I'll share with you one of the experiences that I had as a director of ODIHR when we went to observe elections in the United States. We were very well received in most states. There was one exception, the state of Texas, where the then Attorney General, who is now governor, threatened our international observers with arrest if they come to closer than 100 yards to any polling stations. Of course, we immediately issued a reprimand, and you know who had a field day with that, with all of that? The Russians. So, see, US violating its OSCE commitments. That's why it's so important. It's so important that we try to adhere to some common rules of behavior that we have in this world and that are under strain. And this is what I will talk about. We'll try to talk about in the sense of us all sailing through a perfect storm these days, perfect storm of crisis that we are collectively facing. And I'll try also to set out a bit of how European Union is striving to address them. But let me first explain my title, Commissioner for Crisis Management. This sounds a bit bigger than what it really entails. If the accurate titles were acceptable, they would be longer, and it would be Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and the Disaster Response. I need to explain this at the beginning so that nobody has some strange ideas about me being responsible for energy crisis, financial crisis, relationship crisis. No, I'm working on humanitarian aid and disaster response. And that's enough, honestly, because there is ever more work on both. And I have just come from New York, where I participated in the high-level week of the UN General Assembly session. We have now become almost used to the fact that, you know, every year the UN General Assembly session takes place with the background, against the background of some crisis, some conflict. But this year, this was the case more than ever before. More than ever before. Right in the middle of the week, the leader of Russian Federation decided to escalate enormously his aggressive designs against Ukraine. And this is perhaps one most immediate and pressing concern for us in Europe, but also on this side of the Atlantic, I believe, because Russian aggression against Ukraine has dramatic consequences, not just for the people of Ukraine, not just for all of us on the European continent, but globally. That doesn't change the fact that those who suffer most at the moment are Ukrainians themselves. There are 7 million of them who found refuge in Europe, refugees. In 2022, we have 7 million refugees in Europe. Almost similar number, around 7 million, internally displaced in Ukraine proper. There are massive violations of international humanitarian law that are taking place in Ukraine. What is more, we are all impacted by the consequences of the Russian invasion through this surge of commodity and energy prices. These consequences are felt around the world, and they are felt also in the United States, just as they are felt in Europe. I often say to people who are screaming about their exorbitant energy bills, there is a person who's responsible for that, and his name is Vladimir Putin. But we should not forget the fact that the consequences of this war of aggression are equally or even more painfully felt elsewhere in the world, among those who are already vulnerable. And among the vulnerable, those most impacted are people who are already affected by humanitarian crisis before Mr. Putin decided to invade his neighbor. In parts of Africa that are caught in protracted conflicts, like large parts of the Sahel, like Democratic Republic of the Congo, Central African Republic, or in Syria and neighboring countries, which continue to host millions of refugees themselves, with little prospect of these refugees returning home in any near future. In Yemen, in the Horn of Africa, which is now once again facing prospect of famine on massive scale. All these places, all people in these places are affected by the global commodity price hikes, which are the consequence of the Russian invasion. And we have seen in all these places that I mentioned, we have seen in the past 3 years a crisis within a crisis within a crisis. It's like, you live in a town which is hit by a hurricane. And right after that, your house is flattened by a cyclone. And then on top of it all, you are hit by a tornado. That's how people's lives were affected in all these places, by the pandemic, by the conflict, by the climate change impact, and by the global impact of the Russian war. People whose lives have already been turned upside down by the previous conflict have been then hard hit by a pandemic. And the same people are now being hit by the fallout from the Russian war on Ukraine. This means that people that were already dependent before on humanitarian assistance for their mere survival are now even more dependent on humanitarian assistance. But it also means that people who before were somehow able to get by now also need humanitarian assistance to survive. Let me share with you some figures. Before the pandemic, the first big global crisis that we have witnessed since I started my current job. Before the pandemic, there were 170 million people worldwide who were already in need of humanitarian assistance. 170 million. After 2 years of the pandemic, that figure increased by 30%. 30%, because we all know how the pandemic affected the economic activity, the movement, and so on. But today, this figure of people who are in need of humanitarian assistance is already 280 million, and will most likely continue to grow and surpass 300 million before the end of this year. In Middle East alone, we saw the number of people who need humanitarian assistance increase by 25%. A good case in point is Lebanon. It was once, not so long ago, a fairly prosperous country. This year alone, the prices for basic staples went up by somewhere between 50 and 75%. That was just after, since the war against Ukraine. But if you look 2 years back, 2 years earlier, the food prices in Lebanon have risen 570% since 2020. Or if you look at the East Africa, they import 84% of all the food they need. You can imagine what it means when the prices of this go up. That means that you immediately bump into the problem of food affordability for millions of people. And at the end, due to drought, it's also about food availability. So if you are already poor and vulnerable, this kind of trends are devastating. People can no longer buy food. They will substitute better food for less nutritious food. And in many cases, they avoid really harmful coping strategies. We know, and we probably read the horrible news from Afghanistan, where people sell their organs or their children so that they can buy food. And these are only the most immediate consequences of hunger and extreme poverty. When such multiple crises pile up, chances are that that will also translate into instability, insecurity, forced displacement, and generally a big backward slide in development gains. You probably noted earlier this month the publication of the annual UN Human Development Report. For the first time ever, the Global Human Development Index has declined for 2 years running. And now, in the sense of overall global human development, we have fallen back to where we were in 2016. 6 lost years. All the gains, all the development gains wiped out of the last 6 years due to pandemic, due to conflict, and due to the most recent war against Ukraine. But this perfect storm would not be perfect without a really worrisome and long-term threat that we already facing and we will continue to face for years to come. And these are the effects of climate change. I mentioned already the Sahel region. These are the countries just south of the Sahara Desert. Sahel is the most obvious example. There is drought that is driven by climate change, but this situation is further aggravated by conflicts that affect a very big part of that region. On the other side of the world, you probably noted this month, devastating floods in Pakistan. 1/3 of the country was underwater. Much of it still is. Livelihoods and lives were swept away. We have to be prepared for more of this. There will be more of this kind of mega catastrophes, I'm afraid. Again, with the disastrous human cost and huge setbacks for the hard-fought development gains. And this will also affect us, the rich, the developed world. You had terrible fires in California this summer. There were hurricanes. We had fires in Europe, unprecedented areas of land burned this year in Europe. almost 800,000 hectares. While we may be better prepared to respond to such challenges than the developing world, we will need to change. We'll need to change the ways we think, the ways we live, and we have to deal with the root causes. So, in short, in the past few years, the combined effect of conflicts, of climate change, and of the pandemic has taken a wrecking ball to many of our assumptions about how development is a straightforward and linear process. And this combined impact has also stretched the tools that we have in order to deal with this kind of crisis. We are at the limits of our ability to deal with such crisis. And this takes me to the second part of my thoughts that I want to share with you. How can we improve our ability to deal with what is coming? How can we respond more effectively to explosion of needs around the world? First, quite obviously, most of the humanitarian needs, most of the misery in this world is due to conflicts. Conflicts are the main source of misery and humanitarian catastrophes in the world. At least 80% of humanitarian needs are driven by conflict. And in many of these conflicts, we see blatant disregard for international humanitarian law. In other words, the laws of war. Yes, even wars have laws. And what you see in Ukraine is systematic, brutal violation of all the rules of war. Everything. You know, the prohibition of attacks on civilians, attacks on humanitarian workers, hampering access to those people who need humanitarian assistance. These are all grave, serious violations of the international humanitarian law. And they, in turn, amplify the humanitarian needs. That's why, speaking about laws and rules, we need to strengthen multilateralism. This is the first thing that we need to do. By multilateralism, what do we mean? First of all, we need to support the United Nations. Yes, the United Nations has its own shortcomings. You can see how UN Security Council is paralyzed because one of its permanent members is waging war, aggressive war, unprovoked, unjustified war against a peaceful neighbor. Of course, Security Council cannot do anything because this permanent member has a veto power and no decision can be taken without the agreement of that very permanent member. But United Nations is the only thing we have. There is no other universal organization. There is none. It's the United Nations and its agencies that are the only platform that we all share. And since the challenges that I described are global challenges, we need to act at the global level. And that's why we have to support United Nations. We need a strong and effective multilateral system. And even when the Security Council, the body that bears primary responsibility for international peace and security, is hampered or paralyzed, there are other components of the United Nations that can act, and they do. Just look at Secretary General Guterres' vital role in brokering the agreement between Russia and Ukraine on shipments of Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea ports. This was a vital achievement of enormous importance for millions of people who are facing hunger in Africa, Middle East, and elsewhere. And also in humanitarian assistance in general, the United Nations plays a crucial, indispensable role, central role, because they coordinate our humanitarian efforts. And it is this international order that is embodied in the United Nations that is also under attack by Russia and what Russia does. That's why we need to support it and defend it. And we Europeans will continue to defend the United Nations, its system, multilateral institutions, and international rules-based order, because we are strongly convinced that no country, even the most powerful one, can tackle the challenges that we are facing on its own. It won't work. Either we do it together or we'll fail. My second point is about solidarity. Solidarity is another element that we need if we want to tackle what we already face and what we will face in the future effectively. Under solidarity, I would like to highlight the responsibility for dealing with crises that should be shared. This responsibility should be shared. Those who consistently do the heavy lifting in this regard, like for instance, by donating humanitarian aid, are surprisingly few. It's a very small group. Three biggest humanitarian donors: United States, number one, European Commission, and Germany provide almost 2/3 of all humanitarian aid. Where are the others? We will, of course, not reduce our share. Actually, this year alone, our humanitarian budget, the European Commission's humanitarian budget, is going to be bigger than ever before. It will be like 2.6 billion euros. This is part of our response to the explosion of the humanitarian needs. And also the United States is stepping up. I hope that will remain the case. But even if donors like us, like the United States, like the EU, even if we are making big additional efforts to address this huge increase in humanitarian needs worldwide, we will not be able alone to plug the gap, the growing gap between the needs and the resources. We already see the signals from several humanitarian organizations that they will, for instance, have to cut rations in some humanitarian crisis situations because they lack funding. So we do believe that some other economically well-endowed states should provide more. Some of them provide nothing. And some of those who also sit in the UN Security Council as permanent members also do nothing. To illustrate, for instance, the Russian Federation, total humanitarian aid from the Russian Federation in this year amounts to $3.5 million. Now I compare this with what we do, 2.6 billion euros, which is the same as dollars these days. It tells you something. It tells you that while some are creating the crisis and aggravating humanitarian needs, some others are trying, like us, are trying to mitigate the consequences of this behavior. That's not sustainable and that's not fair. I think that dealing with the human cost of conflicts and disasters should be shared responsibility. And we should think about moving towards a situation where states would share this responsibility in a more equitable manner and contribute to global humanitarian needs, for instance, in line with their economic weight. Also, we should look into private sector, private funding, and other things, but I think that also this responsibility of the states should be shared more equitably. I already mentioned the United States and European Commission being the two biggest donors, but we also cooperate extremely well in general on humanitarian aid. We work very well with USAID. We work also very well with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We are on the ground together in many places with the United States, and we work alongside each other in on issues like response to pandemic, like war in Ethiopia, situation in Afghanistan and elsewhere. We are also conscious that funding alone may not be enough, even if we are able to gather additional funding. So we have tried to invent new ways of helping both humanitarian organizations that are our partners, as well as people who are affected with humanitarian crisis. We have, for instance, developed Humanitarian Air Bridge. This idea popped up at the beginning of pandemic. You will recall that overnight, airports were closed all over the world. Airplanes were grounded, and suddenly people were no longer able to move, including the humanitarian workers. And the humanitarian cargos were not able to move. That's where we launched this initiative, Humanitarian Air Bridge, and we have been able to deliver life-saving humanitarian aid to all corners of the world in the years 2020 and 2021. And this now continues in some other places where there is either no commercial alternative or it's too dangerous to fly, like Afghanistan or Somalia, where with these flights we support humanitarian organizations on the ground, since commercial airlines cannot operate in those places. We are working to expand this model also to other areas, not only transport and logistics, but also other areas where we can fill the gaps that humanitarian actors cannot fill. When I mention solidarity, I would like to share with you also the other aspect of European solidarity that takes place through our emergency response. This is primarily intended to address the natural and human-induced disasters all over the world. We have in place in Europe the so-called Union Civil Protection Mechanism, at the heart of which is an Emergency Response Coordination Center. This is one part of the Commission that never sleeps. It works 24/7, and it embodies the solidarity not only among the EU member states, but also with any country of the world that may need assistance, any country. How does it work? For instance, I mentioned the huge forest fires in Europe, notably in France, for instance. France has a big capacity, firefighting capacity. It has a lot of firefighters, and it has a lot of firefighting planes. But what they experienced this summer was unprecedented. Even the capacity that they have was not enough. There were so many fires, they were so intense, and it was so that for the very first time in history of our civil protection mechanism, France asked for assistance. We immediately mobilized assistance from other member states in the sense of additional firefighting planes, in the sense of additional firefighters. And when we fell short, we tapped our own European strategic reserve, which we call Rescue. This is a reserve that we have started to build a couple of years ago, and now includes firefighting planes, firefighting airplanes. It includes medical countermeasures. It includes shelter capacity, logistics, and the like. And it is used whenever the capacity of other member states to help the affected member state is exhausted. Then we throw our own reserve in the mix. We have done the same with Ukraine. Ukraine asks for all kinds of assistance. You probably read a lot about the weapons and humanitarian aid, but they also ask for a lot of civil protection items. And through our mechanism, we have so far delivered almost 70,000 tons of in-kind assistance to Ukraine in the civil protection area. What does this mean? These are items like food, medicines, shelters, like tents, housing containers, ambulances, fire engines, power generators, heavy machinery, these kind of things. Or for instance, potassium iodide tablets. You are aware of the danger involving the shelling near and around the biggest nuclear power plant on European continent, Zaporizhia, currently under Russian occupation. The danger of a nuclear catastrophe is real, and that's why we are shipping potassium iodide tablets, which you take once there is an explosion or radiation. You have to take it, and that's an example of our assistance to Ukraine through the civil protection mechanism. The next point that I would also like to add to this multilateralism and solidarity in order to face more effectively the challenges ahead is anticipation. What do we mean by that? In many cases, you can predict more or less accurately what will happen, especially with regard to the climate change induced crisis. We know that the summers will get hotter, drier. We know that rainfall will become more intense in certain parts, and you can prepare for that, and you can anticipate. You can anticipate that. You probably all follow the reports by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Their latest report claims that climate change will have the greatest impact on people and systems that are already vulnerable. People who live in highly vulnerable countries and regions are 15 times more likely to lose their lives due to floods, droughts, and storms than people in regions with low vulnerability. That means that in vulnerable settings, the climate crises are ultimately humanitarian crises, and the number of climate-related disasters has already doubled since 1980s. Of course, we need to tackle the root causes, the greenhouse gas emissions. And I think the stakes could not be higher for the upcoming Conference of State Parties, the 27th one in Sharm el-Sheikh in November. And you also see that now that Russia is manipulating its energy supplies, some countries in Europe are reverting back to dirty fossil fuels. We should not allow that to happen. We should actually do the opposite. We should use this crisis, created and aggravated by the Russians, to accelerate our green transition to renewables and low carbon energy sources. My job, of course, is not to solve the climate crisis. There is another commissioner for that, but my job is, or includes, the responsibility to find ways to step up our efforts to improve our preparedness and our anticipation. Because every dollar that we invest in prevention can save up to $7 in response. That's why we are increasing also our funding for disaster preparedness initiatives, including in the framework of our humanitarian aid. Because if you improve preparedness, if you strengthen the resilience, you reduce the humanitarian needs in the future. Let me share you a very good example of how that works. Bangladesh. Decades ago, every big tropical storm that hit Bangladesh resulted in enormous loss of lives and humanitarian crisis. No longer. Why? Because also with our support, Bangladesh is now using a forecast-based approach. They provide cash and non-food items to people ahead of the flood, caused by tropical storm or cyclone. In this way, communities there have the resources to prepare for extreme weather impacts. And in this way, Bangladesh, for instance, has saved tens of thousands of lives every year. Similar projects that we support in preparedness are taking place in Mozambique, Madagascar, Lesotho, Zimbabwe. It shows you that European Union in the area of civil protection, disaster response, and humanitarian aid really acts globally, from Caribbean to the South Pacific. And alongside our disaster preparedness projects, we also aim to mainstream disaster preparedness in all of our humanitarian activities for the reasons that I mentioned before. Because if you equip the most vulnerable, if you increase, strengthen their resilience, next time a crisis hits them, they will be better prepared. They will be better able to cope, and there will be less need for humanitarian assistance. So I will now summarize what I wanted to share with you. One, we are facing explosion of humanitarian needs around the world, driven by this perfect storm of conflicts, climate change, and the effects of the pandemic, which are still there. They are still there. We just hoped that we are out of the woods, but we were not yet. And then the most recent conflict was triggered by the Russians. Second, in view of these record humanitarian needs, we need to uphold and promote international law, including international humanitarian law. This matters because this is the platform for our response that is multilateral and that is inspired by solidarity. And finally, we need to push to broaden the donor base for responding to crisis. And we need to invest massively. We're not doing it, but we need to do it. We need to invest massively in prevention and preparedness. So these are some of the key issues that I wanted to share with you by way of introduction, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments, and I really thank you for your kind attention.
It's more comfortable sitting here, and as I see, we have enough time, and I hope that there will be vivid interest in the audience to pose questions. If I may make a couple of points from my side, how I understood your intervention, your address. I can't agree more with your points how badly we need cooperation and multilateralism these days more than ever, given given the gravity of the crisis, what you described as explosion of humanitarian needs, and we need solidarity. But as you rightly mentioned, we also are living a crisis of cooperation, and we are experiencing lack of trust among major actors, particularly the most powerful ones, which then prevents us from cooperating better. You mentioned one of them. I would add another one, also sitting in Security Council. So, and then definitely this makes the crisis more challenging. So every time we face a crisis, we are faced with the dilemma of what to do. I will quote, I will use a phrase that was attributed to Winston Churchill: never waste a crisis, which means we have always dilemma of what to do. We can be innovative, but we can also slide back to our old habits, as you mentioned, turning back to renewables or turning to renewables, or turning back to fossil fuel and the non-renewables. This is one of dilemmas, for example, on top of many dilemmas. So I would also think about, but I will not answer the question, how much united European Union member states are when it comes to crisis European Union faces. We have witnessed in the previous crisis, for example, migrant crisis, difference in how European Union member states saw the way how European Union should be addressing those crises or that crisis. So this is, I would say, still relevant, maybe below the radar, but still there. So I will stop here then just to give a couple of logistical, let's say, pieces of advice from my side. I would like to take two questions and then to turn to Commissioner Lenarc. Why so? Because I think that by giving a chance to two of you to pose questions, we will cover more questions, because otherwise we may focus on one question, the first question is more, and then other people will not have time to pose questions. So who is going to be the first? Everybody, please introduce yourself, since I don't know you, some of you I know, and then, be short in posing questions. Who is going to be the first? And come to the microphone. Okay, you are the first, and I see the gentleman over there. Okay, please.
Hi. First of all, thank you for being here, and thank you for the speech you just gave. I'm Isabella Trombet. I'm a postdoc at the Center for the Study of Europe, but before that, I was a humanitarian worker for the migration crisis. I'm Italian, and I worked in the Mediterranean for many years, and thank you for bringing that up, because that ties perfectly to the question I was going to ask. So definitely being the Commissioner for Crisis Management in this time is incredibly a crazy time, but all the crises you mentioned are just going to heighten the human mobility crisis that we have, if we want to call it a crisis, in Europe, but worldwide. So my question is going to be, is part of the prevention strategy that you were talking about going to focus on humanitarian protection and different visas, different channels for people to move around globally without having to resort to channels that are extremely deadly and that are really heightening the crisis that Europe is in, especially in countries like Italy, Greece, and Spain that are at the borders. But just today, you were mentioning Lebanon. Just today, I was reading about a shipwreck of a boat filled with Lebanese and Syrian asylum seekers. So thank you.
So Your Excellency, thank you very much for your speech, and welcome to BU. My name is Mohammed, and I'm from Turkey. So my question is, for EU, what is the difference between Syrian refugees and Ukrainian refugees? Because when Syrian refugees wanted a better life in EU, the Greek border police just murdered them. But we see a completely different approach when it comes to Ukrainians. So my question is, for EU, what is the difference between Syrians and Ukrainians? Thank you very much.
Thank you. First question by Isabella. And also Mohammed's question, they're both about migration. Although this is not part of my portfolio, I'll try to offer you some clarifications and partly answers. Now, yes, the climate crisis and conflicts in particular often induce movement of people, displacement. We call it forced displacement, and that is something that we need to manage. You, Professor Gaščević, mentioned that EU is united, yeah, but it's not always united. On the issue of migration, EU is not united. EU has not been able, EU member states have not been able to put in place a coherent migration policy. We've been trying for years. we have not succeeded yet. This is still something where we have to work. At the moment, European Union does not have a coherent migration policy, even though there is a wide agreement that you cannot leave all the responsibilities to manage and handle migration to the frontline states, those member states that are on the external border of the European Union, because that's not the situation. This is something that remains to be done. In the meantime, of course, migrations have to be managed in accordance with international law. And under international law, there is no difference between and among refugees on the basis of their origin or ethnic origin. No difference. Everyone who asks for asylum has to be treated individually and with dignity. So these are very clear international and European norms. There is one difference only in the sense, in the two situations that you mentioned, Mohammed, Ukraine and Syria. There is no third safe country between Ukraine and the European Union. Ukraine is on the border with the European Union. There are some safe countries between Syria and the European Union. That is the difference. That is the difference, and that difference was one of the factors that led to the agreement between the European Union and Turkey on managing the situation of Syrian refugees in Turkey. By the way, over the years, a lot of European Union humanitarian funding and development funding went to Turkey by the sense of our shared responsibility for taking care of the millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey. There are almost 4 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, and it's only fair that European Union helps share this responsibility with Turkey. But Turkey is largely a safe country, and you mentioned people's quest for better life. That's a legitimate desire, but it doesn't give any individual the right to choose the country where to pursue this better life. There is no such right. International law, there is a right to asylum for those who flee persecution or war, but there is no right to choose the country where you want to be. You, as a refugee, for instance, you are supposed to ask for asylum in the first safe country into which you come. And that's the problem that we have within European Union, because most of these movements of people who either are refugees, but you don't know until you conduct all the procedures, or are economic migrants who have legitimate desire to have a better life. But as I said, they don't have under international the right to choose where they will pursue this better life. These movements primarily go to what we call frontline states, member states on the outer border of the European Union. And I believe that it is unfair that all this responsibility to receive the newcomers should be left to them. It should be shared in the spirit of solidarity among all EU member states. That's the philosophy of the many proposals that the European Commission put on the table, but that the member states have so far not been able to agree. I hope they will at some point. But one thing remains unquestionable completely. You mentioned the treatment of migrants or refugees, doesn't matter. All are human beings, and they have to be treated on the external borders of the European in a dignified manner that respects their human rights, including the right to request asylum. Whether they're given or not, that depends on the individual treatment, individual case, in each individual case, but they are entitled to humane and dignified treatment. This is the law, but yes, we know the law is sometimes violated, unfortunately.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'm looking for like a new set of questions. Okay, I see several of you. Please, if you, let's begin with the question, please, Professor Schmidt. Then after her, you, and then I see I notify a couple of you. Okay, please.
Thanks so much for your remarks. I'm Vivian Schmidt, Jean Monnet Professor of European Integration, so another chair, Jean Monnet Chair. And I'd like to ask you a question basically about resources. Do you have enough? Does the EU have enough? Does it do enough in that regard? And I'm thinking about the Temporary Resilience and Recovery Fund. Do you see any chance of a permanent fund? And when I think about such funds, not simply what the money is for now, which is investment in the future, greening the economy, digitalizing society, and addressing social inequalities, but is there a possibility that a new permanent fund would do something like create separate funds for a migration adjustment fund, a refugee integration fund, a humanitarian aid fund that goes beyond what you have? And how would you use this in the context of your job? Thanks.
Thank you. I think, brother.
Thank you, Commissioner Lenarc. We met before, so I don't think I need to introduce myself, but I'm Greta, and I'm a graduate student specializing in global economic affairs at the Party School. I really liked your point on solidarity and the fact that you mentioned that it's paramount to make sure that more countries are brought to the table, to the negotiating table. But then when it comes to practice, I was wondering, how do you do it? And have you observed in the past cases in which countries were indeed brought to the table and they were willing to invest more to become part of that shared effort of channeling investments towards countries that need them? And then following this question, I was wondering, once you secure those investments, sometimes you may have distribution channels problems in the first place. So you may have those resources, but in the end they get dispersed. Has that happened in the past, and how did you tackle this issue? Thank you.
On resources, of course, we don't have enough. But there are some very positive steps that we have been able to take. You mentioned the Recovery and Resilience Instrument. This is something that is completely new. One could even call it revolutionary. When pandemic struck, it has, of course, enormously affected our economies, enormously. And it became clear that if we don't want fragmentation of our single market, a single market is one of the linchpins of European integration. Most important values, but single market is another important pillar of our integration. And this single market was threatened with the possibility of fragmentation. Why? One of the key reasons was that some member states had more fiscal capacity, meaning more space in their budget to compensate and compensate for the negative impact of the pandemic and help their companies and citizens with the government support. Some others, especially those that are that have quite high national debt, were not able to do the same, to help their companies, their businesses, and citizens to the same extent. And therein, we in the Commission, we saw the danger that, some member states with deep pockets would be able to help their companies a lot, giving them privileged, favorable position in the single market, while companies from overly indebted countries would not be given the same kind of support and would therefore have difficulties competing in the single market. We said this must be prevented. And that's why we proposed the Recovery and Resilience Instrument, which is unique and innovative, especially in the sense that it gives the Commission the authority to raise funding on international financial markets and then channel it to member state in proportion with their needs, not their deep pockets or fiscal capacity. What is revolutionary in this is the fact that this is the first time that the European Union is assuming a common debt. This is something that US regularly does, but it's something that EU has never done, at least not in such an extent, to such an extent. Now, there is an agreement within the EU that this has been an extremely positive thing, a very effective measure, preserved the single market, kept our economy and companies above water. There is no disagreement about that this was a positive thing and helpful, but there is no agreement whether to make something like this permanent. There are so-called frugal member states who do not want this to be a permanent feature, but the discussion will continue. I think that over time, this may become a permanent feature or semi-permanent, especially due to the fact that now, due to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, we have a fallout, including economic fallout, that is comparable and in some cases even worse than the one we experienced during the height of the pandemic. And yet we don't have anything similar in place that we put in place during the pandemic, this recovery and resilience instrument. The discussion will continue, I'm sure. What is important for me is that there is universal agreement that this was a good experience, this was a good move. It showed European solidarity. It helped us overcome the economic difficulties during the pandemic. And if it's not going to become a permanent feature, I'm sure that it will be possible to repeat it. On migration and integration, we do have a financial instrument that helps member states with this. It's called AMIF. It's Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, which is used to assist member states that are under migration pressure. It assists them in asylum procedures. It assists them with managing the migrations, and it assists them with the integration, which is one of the possible outcomes of migration. So this exists. It is managed by my colleague, Commissioner Johansson. I myself, I think that in my case, the funding gap is probably the most pronounced. Even though European Commission is among the three biggest donors of humanitarian aid, along United States and Germany, European Commission, the needs out there are such that we would need more resources. We cannot get more resources from our own budget because our budget is tight and it is rigid. There are very slim margins and slim operational reserves that do not allow us to react to all the developments out there. But I discussed this a lot in my introduction. We need to find ways how to fill this funding gap. There are various ways. A simple way is to increase the available resources. We're trying to do that. And this brings me to the second question, how to expand the donor base. There are some who honestly do not contribute what I consider should be their fair share. Who are they? Well, there are some other member state, permanent members of the Security Council. And we should not forget, Security Council of the United Nations is, according to the UN Charter, is a body that bears primary responsibility for international peace and security. Do you feel the weight of these words? And I do, but it doesn't seem to me that those permanent five, at least not all of them, feel that weight too. They are, because they sit there permanently, primarily responsible for international peace and security. And honestly, if you look at the situation globally, they're not doing a very great job. And okay, everybody fails now and then, but then they should at least assume greater share of responsibility for the consequences of their failure, which are humanitarian needs. As I said, humanitarian needs in 80% are the consequence of conflicts, meaning failure to ensure international peace and security. And they should be the ones, in addition to the United States, which is doing a good job on humanitarian aid. There are others who are not doing it. I mentioned already the ridiculously small humanitarian contribution by Russian Federation. The Chinese one is even smaller, by the way. Then there are others. For instance, in the current geopolitical situation, those who export energy are getting windfall profits. And you know who they are? And they should contribute at least part of those profits to humanitarian purposes. Here I have in mind especially the Gulf countries, but they're not the only ones who earn big bucks these days, thanks to the skyrocketing energy prices. So here is where I see room for improvement. But when dealing with the funding gap, you could also reduce it by reducing the needs. And that's why we are thinking of all these things that I talked about: anticipatory action, private sector, billionaire individuals that could do their share and so on. And no, we have never had any problem with disbursement. On the contrary, we have in the Commission, my services are actually the subject of great envy from other services, because we have so flexible rules on funding that we can really mobilize funding in a matter of days when it's necessary. So we don't need long planning and programming procedures. We don't have that. In humanitarian funding, European Union is actually very quick, very responsive. And we have over 200 trusted certified partners with whom we work. They include United Nations agencies, Red Cross family, and international non-governmental organizations who do the work on the ground and to whom we provide our humanitarian funding. And this is well-established, well-oiled machinery, and we have never experienced any difficulties in dispersing the funding.
Okay. Although I come from the Balkans, I like Rus, since I spent quite many years in Austria, Netherlands, and Germany. Therefore, I would like to make sure that everybody understands how we're going to proceed from now on. I acknowledge 4 of you wishing to pose questions. So, and all of you will be giving a chance to pose questions, at least for those 4 that I already acknowledged. So I will go first with the first group, Professor Kaja and the gentleman over there. So you will be the first. The next will be 2 of my former students. So
Welcome to BU. Thank you for coming. My name is Professor Kaja Schilde. I'm a Pardee School professor and Jean Monnet Chair. And this is an exciting conversation to have. I wasn't going to ask you a public question, but I thought there was one that everybody might really like to hear the answer to. So I'm asking it. It has to do with the fact that I'm so glad you brought up that the EU Commission itself is the 2nd largest funder of humanitarian aid globally. That I'm grateful to you for, because I'm planning on mentioning it to my students in the European integration class, that this is something the EU does as an executive action, not through agreement and consensus, but it's delegated to the Commission. It is an executive action of the EU, which they're learning about. The second reason is because it made me think about a dilemma and a debate. I don't want you to get political about it, but it's so fascinating to me. And that is that this reputation of the European Commission in humanitarian aid has been so neutral for decades, meaning that it has not included conditionality. It has not asked things of those it gives aid to. And so in the field, this is considered to be unparalleled in terms of the neutrality and the strength of that aid, meaning people don't get killed in the field when they're doing EU actions. And then the tension is, in the last 7 years or so, is the EU humanitarian action has become more embedded in a larger global strategy and comprehensive kind of whole of government would be the US term, in terms of what is EU external action. It's become a little bit more embedded. And it's interesting when I talk to friends in the field who are humanitarian workers, they say that this has made their lives more dangerous. The idea that EU aid is more politicized. But all of the things you laid out in your speech require politicization. Trying to enforce the rule of law abroad, trying to get other actors to become better donors will require EU strategy that requires a little bit of strategy and conditionality of the EU in the world. And so I just wanted to ask about that dilemma. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you, Commissioner Lenarc, for being with us here today. I really appreciated your presentation. So my question is in the realm of forced migration. So in 2020, Turkey opened up its borders for all refugees to pass into Europe, violating its agreement with the EU made in 2016 due to increased tensions with Greece and to pressure EU member states to support its offensive in Idlib in Syria. So my question is in the realm of how do you deal with countries that utilize forced migration essentially as a weapon? Thank you.
Thank you. You really have all these interesting questions here. We could spend a lot of time with you. But Professor Schilder, thanks for pointing to some of the key challenges that we are facing. First of all, yes, the Commission is able to, let's put it this way, run its own show as far as humanitarian aid is concerned, because unlike many other areas, humanitarian aid is shared responsibility between the Commission, or European Union, and its member states. That's what the Lisbon Treaty specifies. It's shared responsibility. What does it mean? In simple terms, it means that we both, the European Union, meaning the Commission, and member states can do their own thing, whatever they want and however they see fit in the area of humanitarian aid. We have our own budget, we have our own procedures, and we decide what to do with the funding, where to send it, and so what projects to support, and so on. However, we at the same time also understand that if we pursue a joint up action with member states, the impact is greater. That's why we have developed this so-called Team Europe approach, whereby we coordinate very carefully with member states as donors of humanitarian aid, so that there is no duplication, so that there are no blind spots, and so that we maximize the impact of our collective humanitarian action as Team Europe. But we also go beyond. We also go beyond. In many situations, the European Union is the one that actually takes the initiative and coordinates the donors. But even more regularly, we support the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, to do that because we believe there is a need to have a very strong coordination so that the available resources are utilized to a maximum possible impact. Now, as regards the neutrality, We believe we are a good and principled donor, meaning that our humanitarian aid is delivered in accordance with the four basic humanitarian principles of neutrality, independence, impartiality, and humanity. What does that mean? Basically, it means that we go with our humanitarian aid wherever there are needs and on the basis of the needs alone. There is no discrimination, there is no taking sides in a conflict, and so on. We always go where the needs are. So for instance, in Ukraine, since 2014, we have been providing humanitarian aid on both sides of the contact line. On the side under the control of the Ukrainian government, as well as on the side that was controlled by those pro-Russian militias in Donetsk and Luhansk. We want to be neutral. Yet, we are not a humanitarian organization. We are a donor. And as such, of course, we are political. But we try to make a distinction between our political action, external action, and our humanitarian action. And you can see this difference in many places, not just in Ukraine, but also, for instance, in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we have people on the ground, our own people, members of my services, of the European Commission, who help with the relations with our humanitarian partners, who are active throughout the country, and were active already before Kabul fell last August last year. 70% of our humanitarian aid to Afghanistan before the fall of Kabul went to the areas that were not under control of the Afghan government, but were under control of Taliban. And our people were there, and they had operational contacts with the Taliban, because that's necessary for facilitating our humanitarian aid. And of course, our external action service had zero contact with the Taliban, and to this day does not recognize the Taliban regime, as nobody else does at the moment. So you see, we try to make this balancing act in order to preserve the neutrality and impartiality of our humanitarian aid. But at the same time, yes, we are not a humanitarian organization ourselves. We are not an NGO. We are very much a political institution, and we are very much conscious of that. Now, forced migration. Turkey, this is the new word, is one example, but I will use even more blatant one. You remember what was happening last fall on the external EU border with Belarus. Lukashenko, the Belarusian dictator, organized package deals that his agents, consular agents, offered primarily to the Kurds from Iraq. Their consulates in the Kurdish part of Iraq were offering, literally like travel agency, package deals to go to Europe. Involved air travel from Erbil and some other airports in the region to Minsk, the capital of Belarus, and then bus transfer to the Polish border. And there, the Belarusian border guards pushed, often forcefully, these poor people to cross the border. So this is some would say it's weaponization. I don't like the term because these are still people, they are not weapons. But let's call it instrumentalization of migration. What is important is, first, yes, one has to counter that. But while you counter that, you must not forget that these are people. And these people are essentially victims. They were lured by Belarus into this scheme. They paid a lot of money, $10,000 or more per person for this package deal. And the motive was clear. Lukashenko tried to increase pressure on the European Union, in particular in Poland, by inviting all the migrants to participate in this scheme. We countered that. Of course, we tackled the problems at the source. We managed with our partners in the region to close this kind of business that was selling these kind of packages to these people. You know, these people, as I said, are victims. Why? Because they have legitimate desire for a better life. But Belarus, in a very criminal manner, abused and exploited this legitimate desire and instrumentalized these people in order to apply pressure on EU and on Poland in particular. So we of course condemn such practices. People should not be used as instruments for pressure, especially not people who are vulnerable. You know, these are vulnerable people. You know, life is hard in Iraqi Kurdistan. They want better life, and somebody is offering them, you know, sure way to Europe. It's like, you know, trafficking human beings. The same thing. You know, when, young women are lured with promises of well-paid, decent jobs, and then they end up in brothels without documents and being abused. It's the same thing. You know, people are lured into criminal schemes, and this was a criminal scheme. That's why we tackled it, and we tackled it, I think, well. The problem was, and my services pointed to that problem, that not always were these people treated humanely and with dignity. There were cases when they were freezing on the Polish side of the border, and we have called for humanitarian access from both sides of the border, from Belarusian side and from the Polish side, in order for our humanitarian partners to be able to help them with humanitarian assistance. And we also sent considerable funds to our humanitarian partners who had these people on the Belarusian side. The situation was critical. It was winter. Belarusian border guards were pushing these people to Poland. Poland built the wall, didn't let them through, so people were trapped. So what we did, we allocated significant funding, and with the help of our humanitarian partners, at least we provided assistance to these people. But you know, some people, even in Europe, didn't understand this, and I was accused of sending money to Lukashenko, which was, of course, a stupid lie. But I'm sharing this with you. What was the problem in this whole thing on the European side was that these people were not always, in all cases, treated humanely and with dignity as it should have been the case. Even though, yes, they were instrumentalized in a criminal scheme concocted by Belarusian dictator. But still, that doesn't change the fact that these are people. They have to be treated properly.
Okay, thank you. I think that we have time for 2 more questions that I promised. Please, I think read, and then who was the website? Okay. If we have time for more questions, then later on, but I don't think so. But I think that Commissioner Lenarc will be around after the event for 10-15 minutes. So you will have time to ask him what question directly. Please.
Thank you, Professor Garcevic. Commissioner, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciated your words. My name is Reed. I'm a grad student at BU. You spoke a lot in your speech about layered crises, responding to the war in Ukraine, COVID-19, and climate change all at once, and both how the nature of a layered crisis necessitates a different response than if you were handling each one individually, and both the need for proactive measures for these crises. My question is, in the past few years of responding to layered crises, what have you, and more broadly the EU as a whole, in the realm of humanitarian aid, learned from your response, and how will that inform the proactive measures that you plan on implementing or proposing? And what role does gridlock among EU member states play in obstructing a coherent emergency preparedness policy, as it does so clearly in migration, as we heard earlier? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jaden. I'm also a grad student here at BU. You spoke a little bit about the neutral humanitarian mission of the EU versus the political mission. And it made me think of what the Estonian Prime Minister just said, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, about not allowing any Russians into Estonia, even if it's for seeking asylum. And I feel like this is becoming a common strategy among European nations. So my question is, doesn't that go against both the neutral humanitarian mission of accepting asylum and the political mission of the EU of perhaps undermining the Putin regime? Thank you.
Thanks. First on lessons learned from the many crises that we experienced. Yes, we are learning lots of lessons and trying to build on those lessons and improve our readiness, improve our preparedness. I'll give you an illustration. When the pandemic struck, nobody expected it. Yes, afterwards, as it always happens, some people were playing smart. Well, we told you so, but it's not true. It's not true. Nobody, to my knowledge, maybe you detected something else, but to my knowledge, nobody predicted the pandemic of the kind that we experienced since March 2020. And member states reacted at the beginning in a sort of knee-jerk reaction, everyone for oneself. They blocked trade in medical equipment within the European Union, in the so-called single market, which is a violation of fundamental rules on which EU is built. They closed borders within the EU, not external also, but within EU, without even talking to the neighbor on the other side, and that resulted in epic queues on German-Polish border. I remember on the second day after the pandemic was declared, was 50-kilometer queue trucks. Of course, the Commission immediately reacted. We were calling interior ministers, health ministers, and others. Don't do it. Don't do it. You will make matters worse. So it took a couple of days for them to realize that with the everyone for oneself approach, we were doomed. So we were able to solve this very quickly. But then we, of course, started to study the lessons that should be learned. And one of the lessons was that European Union was not prepared. Like nobody else was prepared. Nobody had these bloody masks in stores, at least not enough. Not the United States, not the European Union, not Japan, nobody. Plus, we realized that 90+% of these masks are being produced in one country, China. So there was a scramble, global scramble for masks. So this cannot happen again. We will prevent this. So to make the long story short, 10 days after the pandemic was declared, 10 days later, we had legislative act published in the official journal of the European Union. This is, by the way, more than lightning speed. This is real record speed for the way Europe usually works. But we had this act on the basis of which we have built strategic EU reserves under the brand Rescue of medical countermeasures. This is the scientific term. It's basically masks, ventilators, and some other medical equipment. We now have millions of that hosted in 9 EU member states. EU is paying for that, and EU is managing it. It will never be enough for all 450 million Europeans for the next pandemic when it comes, but it will be enough for the first responders and for the frontline medical personnel, and that's critical. So we are now better prepared. So this is an example of how we try to learn the lessons and act. It's not easy for one particular reason, because health, like migration, is national competence of member states. It's not EU competence. our competence in these areas is only to play supportive role. So member states ask for assistance and we help and we coordinate and we do this, we do that, but it's national competence. Member states are extremely jealous about their national competence. This is one similarity between EU and the US, which otherwise are completely different animals. You know, US is one nation, EU is not. EU is union of nation states. But there is one similarity, both EU member states and the states of United States jealously guard their competences. Whatever is their competence, the federal government better not touch. It's the same thing in Brussels. But, and as Professor Garcic said at the beginning, quoting Churchill, never waste a good crisis. And we didn't. So with this crisis, where everybody realized, well, we didn't have masks, we were not prepared. This time, we will be prepared better, also thanks to the European level strategic reserves. And member states agreed, because we needed their agreement, because this is national competence. Health is national competence, migration is national competence, many things are national competence. But in spite of that, we were able to build this reserve. Now, I was personally quite disappointed when some voices from the Baltic went into the direction that no Russian should be allowed into EU. This is what one could hear now, that young Russian men are trying to escape Russian Federation because they're trying to escape conscription. And I think it would be good to accept all of those who try to escape Putin for various reasons. First of all, because everybody has a right to seek refuge and asylum and has a right to individual treatment when lodging such a request. And second, it would be good assistance to Ukraine. You know, the less conscripts Putin has, the less he can send to Ukraine. So I think I understand, you know, the Baltic countries, they have had their terrible historical experience under the Russian Soviet domination. You know, large chunks, large parts of their populations were expelled to Siberia. A lot of them died, and so on. So one has to consider their historical experience with the Soviet rule. But on the other hand, everyone who is trying to escape Putin's regime should be able to do so. And I think Europe here has a role to play. And I would hope that, of course, there should be also security check of all those, because there is a real danger that some agents of Russian regime would also try to mix into this flow. So there has to be a security vetting of those people who try to come to the European Union. But the bottom line is, I think the doors of European Union should be open to all those who flee persecution, including the Russians who flee conscription, because as you may know, if you do not respond to the summons when you are called to join the army, you run a risk of going to prison for long years. Or if you demonstrate against the war, you can get up to 15 years in a penal colony in Russia. So in short, I believe EU borders should remain open for all those who flee persecution, including young Russian men who don't want to fight the Putin's war.
Okay, I would like to conclude our event today. I know that there are those who wishing to pose questions, and I would like to remind you that you may remain here after the event, and you will be given a chance to pose questions to Commissioner Lenarc. I would like to thank wholeheartedly Commissioner Lenarc for having been with us today, for frank answers. I'm surprised, given I just told this morning my students that I told my students that don't expect somebody who is in official capacity in a public event to be outspoken, because those people represent institutions, the embodiment of the institutions they represent. So thank you very much for your frank and I would say interesting answers. I'd like to thank to all of you who have been with us. Though some of you, I understand some of the students had to leave early because of their classes. We cannot suspend all the classes because of Commissioner. With all due respect for your importance, Commissioner Lenarc, once again, thank you so much.